Richard Nelson had never imagined that a police officer would spit on him, especially not in his own precinct by one of his own officers. But there he stood, the saliva on his face beginning to dry, while the silence around him became deafening, because the room full of police officers didn't yet know who the man their colleague had just spat on really was.
Don't forget to subscribe, leave a like, and a comment before we start to learn more about what happened.
It was a humid Tuesday morning in August when Richard Nelson, the newly appointed police chief, stepped out of his car in the heart of Blue Ridge, a small city nestled in the rolling hills of North Carolina. Dressed in a simple plaid shirt, worn jeans, and scuffed sneakers, he didn't look the part of a man who had spent 2 decades climbing the ranks in law enforcement. That was exactly his intention. Richard believed in seeing things as they truly were, not through the polished lens of scheduled meetings or rehearsed welcomes. As a black man stepping into a leadership role in a precinct plagued by whispers of misconduct, he wanted to observe his department unfiltered. What better way to do that than to blend in? The precinct's parking lot buzzed with officers coming and going. Richard scanned the area, noting the casual banter and occasional glances his way. No one seemed to recognize him, which wasn't surprising. His appointment had been announced just days ago, and he had chosen not to publicize his arrival until the official inspection later that morning. He adjusted the brim of his baseball cap and took a deep breath. The weight of his mission to root out the toxicity festering within the department pressed heavy on his shoulders. He was no stranger to resistance, but he knew this job would test him in ways he hadn't yet imagined. As he approached the building, the faint sound of laughter carried through the air. Richard stepped through the precinct doors, immediately hit by the familiar smell of stale coffee and the hum of activity. Officers moved about their business, some filing paperwork, others preparing for their shifts. The atmosphere felt relaxed, almost too relaxed. Richard made his way deeper into the precinct, his eyes taking in every detail. Near the front desk, a group of officers huddled around a computer screen, snickering at something on the monitor. Their conversation was loud enough for him to catch fragments. "Did you see how scared he looked?" one officer said, his voice thick with amusement. "Man, these people always think they're gonna get away with something," another added, emphasizing the word, "these people," with unmistakable disdain. Richard's jaw tightened, but he kept walking. He needed more than casual racism to build a case for reform. He needed something concrete, something undeniable. The booking area was his next stop. Here, the real work of the precinct happened, where officers processed arrests and interacted with the public. Richard positioned himself near a bulletin board, pretending to read the posted notices while keeping his ears open. It didn't take long. Officer Jake Mitchell strutted into the area, his chest puffed with the kind of arrogance that came from years of unchecked authority. At 32, Mitchell had been with the force for 8 years, and his reputation preceded him. Richard had read his file during his preparation for this assignment. Multiple complaints, all dismissed. Excessive force allegations, all cleared by internal affairs. A pattern that screamed corruption. Mitchell's partner, Officer Danny Torres, followed close behind, looking uncomfortable. Torres was younger, maybe mid-20s, and according to his record, he'd only been on the force for 2 years. Richard watched the dynamic between them, noting how Torres seemed to shrink in Mitchell's presence. "Torres, you're too soft," Mitchell was saying, his voice carrying across the room. "These criminals don't respect soft, they respect fear." "I just think we should follow protocol," Torres replied quietly, his eyes darting around nervously. Mitchell laughed, a harsh sound that made several people in the area look up. "Protocol is for rookies and politicians. Real police work happens on the streets, where nobody's watching." Richard felt his blood pressure rising. This was exactly the kind of attitude that had plagued law enforcement for decades. The belief that badges came with unlimited power, that the uniform made someone above the law. He decided to get closer. Richard walked toward the water cooler near where Mitchell and Torres stood, moving slowly to avoid drawing attention. As he reached for a paper cup, Mitchell's conversation became clearer. "Last night's arrest was perfect," Mitchell was saying, his voice filled with pride. "Guy thought he could mouth off to me just because he had a fancy car. I showed him what respect looks like." "But Jake, he wasn't resisting," Torres said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He was just asking why we stopped him." Mitchell's face darkened. "Don't question me, rookie. I've been doing this since before you knew what a badge was. That guy got exactly what he deserved." Richard's hands clenched into fists. He recognized the scenario Mitchell was describing. It was a textbook case of police brutality, the kind of incident that destroyed community trust and painted all officers with the same brush. But Mitchell wasn't done. "The problem with this job," he continued, his voice getting louder, "is that we have to deal with people who don't know their place, especially the ones who think they're better than they are just because they got lucky." Richard's patience was wearing thin. Every instinct told him to reveal his identity right then and there, to put Mitchell in his place. But he forced himself to wait. He needed to see how deep this rot went. As if sensing his thoughts, Mitchell turned and noticed Richard for the first time. His eyes narrowed as he took in Richard's appearance, the casual clothes, the baseball cap, the careful way Richard was trying to blend in. "Hey," Mitchell called out, his voice sharp with authority. "You." Richard looked up, feigning surprise. "Me? Yeah, you. What are you doing here?" Richard set down his water cup, his movements deliberate and calm. "Just waiting," he said simply. "Waiting for what?" Mitchell demanded, taking a step closer. His hand instinctively moved toward his belt, where his radio and other equipment hung like symbols of power. "Someone told me to wait here," Richard replied, maintaining his calm demeanor. "Said someone would be with me shortly." Mitchell's eyes flickered with suspicion and something else, something uglier. "Who told you that?" "The officer at the front desk," Richard said, which was technically true. He had briefly spoken to the desk sergeant upon entering, but Mitchell wasn't satisfied. He moved closer, close enough that Richard could smell the stale coffee on his breath and see the small scar above his left eyebrow. "You look familiar," Mitchell said, his voice taking on a menacing tone. "Have we met before?" "I don't think so," Richard replied honestly. Mitchell's laugh was cold and calculating. "You sure about that?" "Because I remember faces, especially faces like yours." The racial undertone was unmistakable. Richard felt his muscles tense, but he kept his expression neutral. Around them, other officers had begun to notice the confrontation, but none stepped forward to intervene. "I'm sure we haven't met," Richard said firmly. Mitchell leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow felt more threatening than if he had shouted. "Listen carefully, because I'm only going to say this once. I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing, but this isn't the place for it. This is a police station, not some community center where you can just hang around." Richard's jaw tightened. "I'm not playing any games." "Sure you're not," Mitchell sneered. "Let me guess you're here to file a complaint. Someone hurt your feelings, or maybe you're one of those people who think they can walk into our house and demand special treatment." The room had grown quieter now, with officers either watching the confrontation or pretending not to notice while clearly listening. Richard was acutely aware that this moment would define not just his relationship with Mitchell, but his entire tenure as chief. "I'm here on official business," Richard said calmly. Mitchell's face twisted with contempt. "Official business? You?" He looked Richard up and down dismissively. "What kind of official business could someone like you possibly have here?" The phrase, "someone like you," hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Richard felt the familiar burn of racism, the same feeling he'd experienced countless times throughout his career. But this time was different. This time he had the power to do something about it. "The kind that's none of your concern," Richard replied, his voice steady despite the fire burning in his chest. That was apparently the wrong answer. Mitchell's face flushed red with anger. "Everything that happens in this precinct is my concern, and right now, you're starting to look like a problem." "I'm not a problem for anyone," Richard said. "That's where you're wrong," Mitchell snarled. He turned to Torres, who had been watching the exchange with growing alarm. "Torres, call this in. We've got a suspicious individual refusing to cooperate." "Jake, maybe we should," Torres began, but Mitchell cut him off. "I said call it in." Torres reluctantly reached for his radio, but Richard held up a hand. "That won't be necessary." Mitchell's eyes blazed with fury. "Don't you dare tell my partner what's necessary. You're nobody here. You're nothing." The words hit like physical blows. Richard had heard them before, in different forms, throughout his career. But coming from one of his own officers, in his own precinct, they carried extra sting. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Richard said, trying one last time to de-escalate the situation. "The only misunderstanding," Mitchell said, stepping so close that Richard could feel his breath, "is you thinking you belong here." And then it happened. Mitchell pursed his lips and spat directly into Richard's face. The glob of saliva hit Richard's left cheek and began to slowly slide down toward his jaw. The room fell into absolute silence. Even the ambient noise of the precinct seemed to fade away, leaving only the sound of Richard's controlled breathing and the slight echo of Mitchell's action. Richard didn't move. He didn't wipe away the spit. He didn't retaliate. He simply stood there, his eyes locked on Mitchell's face, watching the officer's expression shift from triumph to confusion, as he realized that his victim wasn't reacting the way he expected. "That's what people like you get," Mitchell said, but his voice lacked the confidence it had held moments before. Something in Richard's stillness, in his complete lack of fear, was beginning to unnerve him. "People like me," Richard repeated slowly, finally reaching up to wipe the spit from his face with the back of his hand. "And what kind of person am I, Officer Mitchell?" Mitchell's eyes widened slightly. The use of his name, which Richard had never heard spoken aloud during their encounter, sent a chill through the room. "How do you know my name?" Mitchell demanded. Richard smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I know a lot of things, Officer Mitchell. I know about your 8 years on the force. I know about the 17 complaints filed against you. I know about the excessive force allegations that mysteriously disappeared. I know about your partner's discomfort with your methods and his repeated attempts to file reports that never made it to the right desks." Mitchell's face had gone pale. Around them, the other officers were beginning to shift uncomfortably, realizing that something was very wrong with this picture. "Who are you?" Mitchell whispered. Richard reached into his back pocket and pulled out his wallet. From it, he extracted his official identification and badge. The gold shield caught the fluorescent light as he held it up for everyone to see. "Chief Richard Nelson," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the now silent room. "Your new commanding officer." The effect was instantaneous. Mitchell stumbled backward as if he'd been physically struck. Torres dropped his radio, which clattered loudly on the linoleum floor. Around the room, officers froze in place, their faces reflecting a mixture of shock, horror, and dawning realization of what they had just witnessed. Mitchell's mouth opened and closed wordlessly, like a fish gasping for air. His eyes darted around the room, seeking support that he would never find. The other officers had taken careful steps away from him, distancing themselves from what they now recognized as career suicide. "Chief Nelson," Torres managed to stammer, his face flushed with embarrassment and fear. "Sir, we didn't know." Richard held up a hand to silence him. His eyes never left Mitchell's face. Officer Mitchell, he said, his voice calm and professional, you are suspended from duty effective immediately. You will surrender your badge, your weapon, and any other department property in your possession. Mitchell's hands shook as he reached for his badge. Chief, this is all a misunderstanding. I was just doing my job, I thought. You thought what? Richard asked, his voice sharp enough to cut steel. You thought it was appropriate to spit on a citizen. You thought your badge gave you the right to treat people like animals. You thought being a police officer meant you could abuse your authority without consequences. I didn't know who you were, Mitchell pleaded, as if that somehow made his actions acceptable. That's exactly the problem, Richard replied. It shouldn't matter who I am. Your behavior toward any citizen, regardless of their race, their appearance, or their social status, was completely unacceptable. The fact that you're only concerned about it now because I'm your boss tells me everything I need to know about your character. Mitchell fumbled with his badge, his hands shaking so badly he could barely remove it from his uniform. When he finally managed to get it free, he held it out toward Richard with trembling fingers. Richard didn't take it immediately. Instead, he looked around the room at the assembled officers, making eye contact with each one. Let me be very clear about something, he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the space. What you witnessed here today is exactly the kind of behavior that will not be tolerated under my command. Officer Mitchell's actions were not just unprofessional, they were criminal. He assaulted a citizen, used racial intimidation tactics, and abused his authority in ways that bring shame to this badge in this department. He turned back to Mitchell. You're not just suspended. You're fired, and I'll be recommending criminal charges. Mitchell's face crumpled. Please, Chief. I have a family. I have a mortgage. This job is all I know. You should have thought about that before you decided to spit on someone, Richard replied without sympathy. Your family deserves better than a husband and father who thinks abuse of power is acceptable. He finally took the badge from Mitchell's outstretched hand. Security will escort you out. You have 5 minutes to clean out your locker. Any department property not returned will result in additional charges. As if summoned by his words, 2 security officers appeared at Mitchell's sides. The disgraced cop looked around the room one last time, perhaps hoping for some sign of support or sympathy. He found none. His former colleagues avoided his gaze, and Torres had turned away entirely. As Mitchell was led away, Richard addressed the room. I want to see every supervisor in the conference room in 10 minutes. We need to discuss some immediate changes to how this department operates. The officers began to disperse, many of them whispering among themselves. Richard could catch fragments of their conversations, most expressing shock at what they had witnessed, but some revealing underlying concerns about the new chief's approach. Torres approached hesitantly. Chief Nelson, he said, his voice still shaky, I want you to know that I never agreed with Officer Mitchell's methods. I tried to report some of the things I saw, but the reports disappeared, Richard finished for him. I know, Officer Torres. That's going to change. In fact, I'd like to speak with you privately after the supervisors' meeting. Your observations about departmental culture could be very valuable. Torres nodded gratefully. Thank you, sir. I was starting to think I was the only one who saw problems. You weren't, Richard assured him, and you won't be anymore. As the room cleared, Richard stood alone for a moment, processing what had just happened. The confrontation with Mitchell had been worse than he'd imagined possible, but it had also been exactly what he needed to justify the sweeping changes he planned to implement. He walked to the men's room and looked at himself in the mirror. The spot where Mitchell's spit had landed was still slightly damp. Richard washed his face thoroughly, symbolically cleansing himself of the encounter. When he looked up again, he saw not just Richard Nelson, the man, but Chief Nelson, the leader who would transform this department or die trying. The intercom crackled to life. Chief Nelson to the conference room. Chief Nelson to the conference room. Richard straightened his shirt and headed toward what would be the first of many difficult conversations. As he walked, he reflected on the irony of the situation. Mitchell had tried to humiliate him, to put him in his place. Instead, the officer had provided the perfect demonstration of everything that was wrong with the Blue Ridge Police Department. Change was coming whether they were ready or not, and it would start with the simple principle that respect was earned, not demanded, and that a badge was a symbol of service, not supremacy. The real work was just beginning.